If I were to describe how the average Catholic looks at the world today, I describe it like this. Broad and wide is the way that leads to heaven, and everybody's going that way. And narrow is the door that leads to hell, and hardly anybody's going that way. But you know what? That's just the opposite of what Jesus himself tells us the situation is. Broad and wide is the way that leads to destruction, and many are traveling that way. And narrow is the door that leads to life, and few there are who are finding it. Now, Jesus didn't say this because this is how it has to be. People who are on the Broadway don't have to stay on the Broadway, and that's where we come in. That's where our prayer, that's where our love, that's where our intercession, that's where our witness comes in. We need to really invite people to leave the path that's leading to destruction and find the person of Jesus Christ who can lead them to true life here on this earth and eternal life.
Hi, welcome to Choices We Face. My name is Peter Herbeck. We're here today with Rebecca Oas. Rebecca is the Associate Director of Research for the Center for Family and Human Rights, right?
That's right, yes.
I got it right. That's a mouthful. Welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, I'm delighted that you're here because you've got your hands on in the organization you're part of, which is also called CFM, right?
That's
Working
right.
with the UN, and have a lot to share about kind of what's happening in the battles there with the UN and family and issues like that. But before we get there, can we talk a little bit more, let's talk a little bit about your faith, kind of where it began for you, your faith experience, your background.
Sure. Well, I grew up right here in Ann Arbor. I was blessed to be raised in a wonderful home with loving Christian parents. It was actually, we had two Christian denominations present in my home. My father was, at the time I was born, Presbyterian. My mother was a recent Catholic convert. So I was raised Catholic. My brother was raised Presbyterian, my sister Catholic.
Wow.
And so my father and my brother both converted to the Catholic Church some years later. But I had a wonderful childhood. God was definitely at the center of our home. And so it was a great experience to grow up in an ecumenical Christian community, but to receive, the full teaching of the Catholic Church, both in the home and, at other places at school.
Yeah, and so many people today in your demographic, the young, the millennials, the statistics are a little bit grim sometimes. When people look at them and say the number of millennials who are leaving the church or don't find the compelling faith in the church and they're drifting into other things. And why has it meant so much to you? And what kind of events, maybe what things in your past helped you really hold on to your faith as you were growing up through high school and into college? And so.
Well, I think one of the things that everyone has to do as they become an adult believer is to really embrace it for themselves. There comes a point where it can no longer just be something you inherited from your family. I remember when I was in college looking at a lot of the people around me and wondering what would have happened if I had been born into a different family, one where they were of a different faith or no faith at all. I saw a lot of my peers doing things that I knew I couldn't, morally justify doing, and yet they didn't seem bothered by it. And, just thinking through, does my faith actually make sense on its own merits? Was I born into a family that actually had it right? And it took a process of kind of going through the logic of it, and seeing some of the consequences that some of my friends were facing from their decisions and coming to the conclusion that, this made sense.
And how did it make sense to you when you say the logic of it? What does that mean to you when you say that?
I think, life choices have outcomes. When you make decisions that we know from our faith are wrong, there's also God created us, He knows how human beings operate best, and when you operate outside of that, there's a toll that it will take, on your emotional health, your physical health, your life, opportunities, and the best outcomes happen when you're living the way God intended for you to live.
Yeah.
And so there was, a combination of realizing that the Christian faith led to a good outcome for human flourishing, but also seeing some of the negative experiences that other people went through from, doing things that did not fit that model.
Yeah. And so you grew up in an environment of faith in your family.
Yes.
But then your life took an interesting journey. You went off to college and you ended up going on and getting a doctorate in genetics and molecular biology, right?
Yes.
And so here's the collision of faith and reason that can often happen. Like how does a scientist like you continue to believe what you believe?
Well, see, I just never saw it as a clash at all. I mean, all truth is God's truth. What we're trying to do, as scientists in the biological sciences, the biomedical sciences, is we're trying to better understand the human body that God created. Regardless of how you believe the body came to be, you can still look and see, how cells work, how tissues and organs work. So those processes are things that we can explore regardless of how we, what we believe about the human person. Certainly, when you get into the bioethics, you have to look beyond just what you can see empirically. You have to think about what ought to be as opposed to what is. But the areas where I was working, looking at cell adhesion molecules, didn't really get as deeply into those areas.
What is this? I'm just curious. What is a cell adhesion molecule? What is it?
Well, basically, if you think about the way our bodies are made up of cells, they have to be able to stick to each other in order for tissues to have integrity, in order for our bodies to hold together. And I was particularly looking at the vascular endothelium, that's the thin lining of cells in the interior of blood vessels. And if you just think about the way your blood vessels work, you've got blood going through those vessels, you need to have some impermeability. You have to be able to keep the blood in the vessels and have it not leaking out everywhere, but you also have to have a selective permeability so that white blood cells can get out, and into areas of inflammation. So you have to have a system that can be regulated in real time. And so we were studying the molecules on the surface of cells that interact with the molecules on the surface of adjacent cells that can hold those cells together, but also allow them to come apart when the body needs them to.
You're trying to figure out what holds us together.
Yes,
Yeah.
and how that's regulated.
I'm glad somebody's
respond.
thinking about that, what holds us together, yeah. Now, when you were studying, did you meet other scientists who were kind of clear about their faith, knew the Lord, practiced their faith? What was the environment like for you?
Well, there were a lot of, at least, people who were raised nominally Catholic in my department. There were some people who were living out their faith, more or less. I never found it to be a problem, in working in that environment. There were people of all different belief systems, and again, it didn't directly impact on the work we were doing. What was interesting to me was when you get into the ethics side, because our program was partly funded by government grants, we had to have an ethics component in our training, and the ethics that we were taught were very devoid of morality. It was very much, here's how you give credit, to somebody else if you're using their work. Here's how you, try and avoid causing animal suffering, beyond what's necessary if you're working with animals. But when it came to things like what should we do when it comes to, interfering with, say, human embryonic stem cells, things like that, there really was not a whole lot being discussed.
So interesting when they talk about ethics,
Yes.
They talk about ethics and how you relate as scientists and how you produce your work, as opposed to having an ethic about what are we actually doing physically,
Right.
And so and I think lots of people are confused, but also a little frightened about what's happening in the whole area of genetic engineering, and should we be able to genetically engineer our own children?
Exactly.
I mean, what kind of contribution is the church making to that question, would you say, or even maybe the work you're doing now? I'm not sure. What brought you into genetics, first of all, and then how do you see what's happening to bring some kind of morality to the whole issue?
Right. Well, my undergraduate work was actually in environmental biology and zoology, so much more ecosystems, animals. I sort of shifted into biomedical research, mainly because there's always going to be a need for health research being done. It was kind of a natural progression. I started working in a lab that was more biomedical and kind of kept on that path. I think certainly the Catholic Church is doing a lot of really great cutting edge work on the ethical issues, and of course it's not as if we're just coming to these principles, we're applying age-old principles to new systems, to new understandings that we have from science. So there's a lot of continuity there. What's disturbing is that the generations of new scientists coming up are receiving, as part of their training, a very imperfect and incomplete view of that. They're not even being asked sometimes the tough questions. Meanwhile, they're being given the skill sets and the tools to do a lot of things that are going to require a lot of looking at ethically later.
What are the foundational principles that the Catholic Church is bringing to the whole area? Give us an idea of what key things they're trying to communicate to the whole endeavor.
Well, certainly the importance of the human being at all stages, from conception or sperm egg fusion onward, that you have a human being who is, equal morally to every other human being. And so the idea that you can disaggregate or take apart a human being at some stage for some other good, that you can't do evil in order that good might result. Another area that's certainly big in Catholic bioethics is end-of-life issues. The more we're able to, prolong human life, the more lifespans are naturally increasing for all kinds of reasons, the more we have, an aging demographic, and the question of how to handle end-of-life becomes extremely important.
Which is why things like death with dignity or whatever, these things are emerging, and people are saying, well, look, gosh, mom and dad might be around a lot longer than anticipated, and people are concerned about draining on their own finances or don't know how to care for them. So now the option, they're saying really the loving thing to do, mom and dad, is just to be willing to take a pill at some point and peacefully just go away. There's that kind of pressure, I think, that's emerging in the culture.
Absolutely. And also the issue of people with disabilities. For example, children with Down syndrome. There are some efforts in different countries to try and eradicate Down syndrome, which means basically aborting children who have Down syndrome. And so, there's disability rights issues, bioethical issues, all of this comes to bear. And the Catholic Church is really showing the way to go forward in a moral way. Unfortunately, a lot of those messages are not being taught to a lot of the researchers, unfortunately.
Yeah, they're just kind of just being that prophet in the world. The church is always that prophet saying, wait a minute, you cannot forget the human person, the reality of the eternal soul and the reality of the dignity of this person. And science seems to want to just ignore it, to close its ears and don't want to accept that.
Well, a lot of scientists do. I mean,
okay.
Science itself, I think, is obviously an important thing. It's the learning about what is. Yeah. And of course, God created what is. It's when you get into what ought to be that you can't just rely on what you can find out in a lab, looking through a microscope, a telescope. That's where your empirical ability to explore runs into, a dead end, and you have to look to something else.
Now, let's talk about your work at CFAM just for a bit. What's happening? Tell our listeners, what is CFAM? Where are you located? What are you doing? What's your primary mission?
Absolutely. Well, CFAM, or the Center for Family and Human Rights, is an organization that is an NGO or a non-government organization who looks at issues of life and the family within international institutions. So primarily we focus on the United Nations, but we're also interested in the European Union, the Organization of American States, basically these multilateral groups that produce documents that are intended to inform our collective understanding of human rights, development, and so on. CFAM, along with several other pro-life and pro-family organizations, really emerged out of a conference that happened in 1994 in Cairo, Egypt, the International Conference on Population and Development, where there was a big push by a lot of feminist groups to create an international human right to abortion. And now Pope John Paul II issued a call for people to get involved, to pay attention to what was going on in the United Nations, and a lot of people who had never worked in that arena before came and answered that call. And our group was one that was founded out of that call and remains, a constant presence in New York, looking at the UN, also in Washington, D.C., tracking what our government is doing on these issues in international arenas, where our funding is going, and so on.
What concretely then, on a daily basis, do you end up doing? What does that look like?
Sure. Well, CFAM does several different things. One thing we do is we report on what's going on in these institutions. A lot of this stuff you won't get in the mass media.
For example, give us an example maybe of some of the hot issues that you guys are really paying attention to.
Sure. Well, we have a weekly newsletter that is, it's now an email newsletter anyone can sign up for, called the Friday Facts. And every week we put out 2 news stories. Some of the topics we've been covering recently, the UN is rolling out its big development agenda for the next 15 years, the Sustainable Development Goals and the post-2015 Development Agenda. And so we've been reporting on the negotiations as they're happening. The General Assembly is about to start this month. All the world leaders come, and of course, following that, all the different committees have their resolutions. So we're looking at what the language is going into those resolutions and reporting on the debates as they're happening. So definitely reporting is one of the things we do. Another thing we do is try and influence the debate and inform the direction of the debate by working directly with UN delegates who are, who come from a pro-family and pro-life perspective, helping craft language that's good, helping craft, come up with ways to remove language that's negative, providing sort of an institutional memory, since a lot of the delegates come in for 3 years and then shift out. So we definitely try to influence where the discussion goes on these issues and lobby directly with the delegates. And then also we have longer term scholarly research that we do, and that's the area where I work the most.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about that. We're going to take a little break first, Rebecca,
Sure.
and then our friends are going to just see a little bit of a commercial spot.
Sounds
then
great.
we'll come back and talk about specifically what you're doing and the research that you're heading up for CFM.
All right.
Friends, we'll be back in just a minute. God bless.
It is here where you'll find the best marriage counselor, greatest healer, wisest teacher, and closest friend.
I need your grace. I need your favor. I need your mercy. I need a Savior.
Welcome back. I'm here with Rebecca Oas. Rebecca is the Associate Director of Research for CFAM, an NGO. What's an NGO again?
It's a non-governmental organization.
That
Basically,
works at the UN.
Yeah, it's civil society as opposed to the delegates of a particular country.
Yeah, and so we've been talking about the mission, the overall mission of CFAM. Now you have a particular role in that overall mission. Why don't you tell our listeners what that is?
Sure. Well, as we talked about earlier, I was trained as a research scientist. I no longer work at the bench with cell cultures, but now I do a lot of analysis of data, looking at health statistics, looking at the numbers that are used to form the arguments on the issues that we work on at the UN, in particular regarding human life. So, for example, there's the case being made that in order to have good women's health or good maternal health, you have to have legal abortion, but the numbers don't necessarily show that. There are countries who have achieved extremely good numbers on women's health, very low levels of maternal mortality, while keeping their laws on, defending the unborn in place and even strengthening those laws.
So your research would say, first, on the other side, there's an ideology that's pushing, so we need to have reproductive health all over the world. And the U.S. is actually pushing it pretty strongly, aren't we, in the current administration, right?
Yes.
And so they put up their own data, why they say it needs to happen in these countries, and you guys are combating and saying, wait a minute, here's the research we've seen. Mm-hmm. And so that's basically what you're doing, correct?
Right. I mean, I think the key here is the idea that a comprehensive women's health or reproductive health program has to include certain things, that it has to be everything. Because to be frank, the people making the argument in favor of abortion don't want to use the word abortion if they can get away with it. It's very controversial. So if you just say women's health, reproductive health, that seems on face value like a much more neutral term.
Everybody's for health, good health, right?
Right, of course. Yeah. But the truth is you can achieve the good health outcomes by doing other things. You will never have a country where abortion could possibly be deemed safe for women where it's not safe to give birth, because the very same things will cause deaths, whether it's hemorrhage or sepsis, infection. If you have a country where you have good roads, where you have good hospitals, people's health from all causes will be better.
How about the whole population control folks? There's what's the basis of their argument? How do you guys counter it in terms of your own research?
Right. Well, I think certainly in the 1960s, there was that book, The Population Bomb by Paul Ehrlich, which really, I think, caused almost a frenzy, of people worrying about overpopulation. And what's happened is, just the passage of time has shown that those arguments have not come true. So some of it is just people seeing that this hype was excessive. But then there's also the question of, okay, what are we actually doing? What kind of programs do we need to have internationally, in dealing with human population? We have seen huge human rights violations in the name of lowering population growth. The one-child policy in China, for instance, has caused so much devastation.
A huge demographic problem right now that they're facing. They
Absolutely.
They don't have enough girls. They don't have enough women in the population.
Well, they don't have enough people, first of all. And then there's the gender imbalance, the sex imbalance where there's selective abortion and, of girls. And so, and then there's the question of, in countries like India where they've had forced sterilization camps. There was, this was in the news just about a year ago where several women died from hastily done sterilizations in these camps. And so, it is a huge, women's human rights issue, certainly.
So how does your faith inform that research that you're doing? How do those two things go together without people saying, I would think as I'm listening to what you do, a lot of people say, well, CFAM is just trying to push a religious ideology on everybody. as opposed to, what you're doing is finding the research and saying, sure, there's a coherence between the faith and what we see, but it's based on your research.
Right. I mean, when we make our arguments, in the UN systems and in other institutions, we're not arguing based on what's written in papal encyclicals. That certainly informs our understanding for ourselves of, how the world works and where our faith comes to bear on that. But when we make these arguments, we're making them in a pragmatic way that could be just as accessible to a Muslim or a person who's non-religious, because, those are the places where we're working.
Do you find that the research is compelling enough, or is it just an ideological struggle and people on the other side don't care what the research looks like that you're producing because they've got their own and they know what they need to move ahead their plan? Is that, it sounds a little bit cynical, but isn't that how it works often, or no? Are the delegates very sincere, just give me the data, I just want to know what's real and base my decisions on that?
Well, I think part of the problem is that you'll hear statistics all over the place at the UN, and it's hard, if you don't know the origin of that statistic, to debunk it on the spot. And so a lot of what I do is actually saying, well, where does that come from? Does that really make sense? Is that even true? And a lot of times you'll find that the statistics being used are more than 20 years old, and they were based on an invalid comparison to begin with, and yet they've taken on a life of their own. It's like the game of telephone, where it just gets repeated and often distorted in the process. So I think a lot of what I'm trying to do is at least, urge people to think about these statistics for themselves. Do they make sense? And also one of the problems is you would like to think that the science is based on, simply, empirical studies of what is. Unfortunately, when the people defining the terms of how the question is being asked have a big agenda and a lot of bias, that gets incorporated into even how the questions are asked. So if you have a survey and you're looking at the results of the survey, what kind of questions were asked of the people makes a huge difference in terms of what you're going to get out of it. Yeah. And so uncovering that bias and trying to push for at least intellectual honesty in the way that the research is being reported and conducted and pointing out the distortions is a lot of what I personally work on.
How does the CFM's voice get heard? How does it work at the UN? The research you're doing and the papers you put ahead, who do you talk to? You just individually to delegates? Do you get to speak to the whole big portions of the assembly? How does it work?
Well, we do both. We certainly have relationships with individual delegates and we give them information. A lot of times these delegates, especially from developing countries who have a limited staff, they're working on several things at once. They don't have time to go really deep on every issue. And so what we can do is be a resource for them and provide them with the information so that can help inform their position. We also, as an accredited NGO at the UN, we are able to, at various times, make interventions on our own behalf. So sometimes they will have a meeting where civil society members can, give a statement. And so we try to engage in those forums as well and provide our own voice, speaking on our own behalf.
Do you find that there's quite a few delegates and members of the assembly that are just genuinely open to hear? They just want to hear. They want to know what's there and they want to base their decisions on that? Or do you find it's divided by ideological camps?
Well, certainly the delegates are constrained by their capitals. Mm-hmm. They can't promote something that's contrary to what their government tells them to do. And so a lot of what they can do, it depends on who's in office in their own countries and what agenda they have. There are some countries who, even if the individual diplomat might be sympathetic to our position, they can't do a whole lot. But by the same token, there are some people who are, very much with us on the issues. And, so we'll work with people who are interested in strengthening these arguments. Obviously, we'd work with people from countries even that aren't, with us, in capital. But yeah, there's limitations on what delegates can do.
Yeah, very good. Well, we're going to take a little break, and we'll be back. When we come back, I want you to tell our listeners how they can get in touch with the work that you're doing at CFM. But friends, first I want to tell you about a new booklet that Ralph Barton has just written called Forever Grateful for Mercy, God's Mercy. We all stand in need of God's mercy, and this booklet we want to be able to give to you free of charge, just for the asking, so that you can lay hold of God's mercy for your life. We'll be back in just a minute.
There's a lot of talk about mercy these days, but not a lot of understanding about what it actually is. And besides, there's a huge deception which presumes that God is so merciful that hardly anyone will be lost. In this booklet, I explain what Scripture and the Church actually teach about mercy and what kind of response is necessary for it to be effective in our lives. I also explain what Jesus told St. Faustina about divine mercy and the tragic consequences of not responding to it wholeheartedly. This booklet will greatly help you live with confidence in turbulent times and will help anyone you share it with to open their hearts to receive mercy while there is still time. Order your free copy today by going to renewalministries.net or by calling 1-800-282-4789.
Welcome back. We're here with Rebecca Oas, who works with CFAM, a non-governmental organization that works at the UN, and she's been sharing with us just some really important work, that foundational work and the frontline work you guys are doing there. First, tell our listeners how they can get in touch and how they can support the work that you guys are doing.
Absolutely. Well, our website is www.c-fam, as in family.org. All of our work, our Friday Facts, you can subscribe to there. Our research is posted there. So that's a good way to keep in touch with what we're doing, and if you want to support us financially, there's a place there on the website to do it. Also, I want to mention that we have a program that's a one-week sort of a class called the Edmund Burke Fellowship, which is every January. And so for graduate level students who are interested in the work we're doing in international law, things like that, that's a good opportunity, something to look for also on our website.
Yeah, and I think another way people can support you is in prayer. I mean,
Absolutely.
This is a big spiritual battle that you're just thinking about the work, what's happening to the family and all the redefinitions and it's kind of the deconstruction of the family. That's really at the heart of what you're doing, isn't it?
Absolutely it is, yes. And I think one way that, as Americans in particular, we can look at is keeping our own government honest, looking at what our government is doing internationally, because a lot of anti-family pressure from the U.S. is being inflicted, in other countries. And so when we think about who we elect to office, we have to think not only of what they're going to do for us, but what impact they're going to have on the world around us.
Leadership really matters.
It does.
Yeah, and thank you for the leadership that you're exercising. I mean, there's a lot of things you could do with your degree and the gifts that God's given you, but you really stepped into this. You're using your talent, inspired by John Paul II and others, to just get into the fight. And I just want to encourage those who are listening, even young people who might be listening today, to get into the fight, to hear that call and to take your place, because there's a real battle. There's a real battle going on, and we need all kinds of talent. We need everybody kind of focused on it at this hour in the life of the church. I know a lot of people are shaken up by the deconstruction of family. It looks very grim, but what we're called to do is to be faithful to what God has made us for, to bear witness to the truth and to live the truth. So, Rebecca, thank you for the way you've witnessed to life, to family, and to your faith.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And friends, we ask you to continue to pray for the ministry, the work that we're doing here. Please pray for CFAM and the work that they're doing. It's really important. Never forget that in the end, the King wins. God bless you. Have a great week. So.